Welcome from me, Marion. I'm joined here by our panelists, Angela, Brett, Amandla, and Winnie, and by Robin, who's assisting us with the tech this morning. Welcome to this webinar on wellness in the workplace. Thanks for joining us. Conflict dynamics has picked up on this topic due to the increase that we've had in requests for mediations, facilitations, and training on conflict management and dispute resolution specifically, but with there's definitely an increase in the concern about creating well workplaces and the brief we get in many instances from our clients to do that. So we thought this would be a fascinating topic, especially also I have to give SAS Law credit for making this a really pertinent subject at the conference last year, and that's how we were introduced to many of the presenters here today because of the work that they've been doing in the area of wellness. Generally, there is a growing awareness of how important it is to have a positive and constructive work life. That contributes to general health and happiness and, of course, to organizational success. In this, there's almost a kind of a dual agenda. There's an individual plight from individuals to be in environments that really feed wellness rather than ill health. And there's an organizational imperative in order to have employees who are productive, who are able to meet the challenges that organizations have and the targets that they set. The reality, of course, is that workplaces have employees who are disengaged from the business strategy, have low morale, have excessive absenteeism in the workplace, and have low mental and overall health. This is fed by employees as they face challenges relating to job insecurity, financial problems, health challenges, and other social and community challenges that impact them. So it really is a cocktail for ill health, I guess, and especially for people who are vulnerable in those situations. So those are hopefully the type of issues that we'll deal with today. Given an even greater demand for well-managed workplaces, and many employees have experienced the safety of home-based work during the pandemic, I think we really find that people are becoming more assertive of the workplace. There is additional pressure on employees on employers as a result of that to create and maintain workplaces that are safe and nurturing. Today, our guests will be picking up on the area of employee wellness and will present proactive remedies, new ways of seeing the issues, and some of the consequences of managing employee wellness in the workplace. So those are kind of all the areas that Angela, Brett, Amandla, and Winnie are going to be addressing today. Please post questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those. Robin and I'll keep an eye on those actually and incorporate them into the conversation. The way that we'll deal with the day is we'll give each of our panelists an opportunity to present. We'll then have a conversation between the panelists and you, the attendees, and then we'll wrap it up in about 90 minutes time, which we kind of feel is the comfort moment, that 90 minutes behind a screen. Okay, good. So I'm going to ask the first panelist, Brett Abraham. Brett is from Weber Wenzel, and Brett, we've asked him to start as the first input today, because he's done a lot of work on defining ill health and well-being in the workplace by looking at the definition slightly differently. So he'll be putting it into a different perspective, I think, or certainly he did for me when I read his paper initially. So Brett, over to you for 10 minutes.
Thanks, Marion. I'm really going to hope to get through as much as possible in the 10 minutes, but let's maybe start with this. Like most things you get interested in something because it lands on your desk as a problem. And when you start unpacking the problem, you realize that it's far more than just a specific client-related problem, and it's actually something that you can look at entirely differently. Instead of solving a problem, we can prevent the problem. And that's what led to this sort of unpacking of the concept of neurodiversity, now more so than a problem that needs to be solved. It's an issue in the workplace that we need to be looking at entirely differently, and we need to be giving the same pride of place in our organization as we would to very many other aspects of diversity. So neurodiversity as a concept is any disorder which is, and I've got to read this because it's a bit long-winded, there's variations in the human brain and cognition which affect areas of sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions. So the basic examples and the ones that we would all know and are very topical outside of the workplace would be autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, and OCD. So that's what we understand to be neurodiverse conditions. Of course, these are spectrum-related conditions. So you might have persons who are affected by one or more of these conditions to a greater or a lesser degree. And post the pandemic, workplaces are and have to look at the impact of ill health, mental ill health, so much more differently for a couple of reasons. One, when people were stuck in their houses staring at screens, they realized that they weren't and they didn't have to just accept that workplaces look and feel a certain way. They don't anymore. And for persons that have neurodiverse conditions, that is equally true. So what is a neurodiverse condition? It's based on the concept of biodiversity. So biodiversity says that what is necessary in order to conserve an ecosystem is that we have biodiversity is not necessary in order to conserve the ecosystem. Neurodiversity is necessary in a society in order to recognize and develop the strengths that are associated with these conditions. So historically, we recognized these conditions, and when I say historically, hundreds of years ago, as illnesses, as people being possessed, all sorts of strange things. We now have tests and persons are diagnosed. I know when I was younger, it was not something that was very topical. These days, persons are picking up on, and doctors are picking up on ADHD and autism, Tourette's at a much younger age, and kids are getting treated. Those kids who were treated 10 years ago for ADHD when they were 7 or 8 years old are now entering the workplace, and they're accepting of their condition. They understand their condition, and they want their employers to understand their condition as well. What a neurodiverse condition has generally is what we would call a spiky profile. So you test persons on what is called the Reschler Adult Intelligence Test. And if you are neurotypical, you would have a relatively flat profile. So on all the parameters that they measure, you achieve similar results throughout. And on a graph, you have a flat profile. Somebody who is autistic or has ADHD would have a spiky profile. A spiky profile means there are areas of obvious weakness, but equally areas of exceptional strength. And the move away from recognizing this as a problem suggests that we should be focusing on, and we can enhance and foster the strengths associated with these conditions to the benefit of our workplace. I'm going to use one example. Let's use autism. We all understand autism as a social disorder. It affects somebody's abilities to pick up on social cues, but equally, a person who has autism will be thoroughly punctual and rule observant. We've all seen it on TV over the years, workplaces where varying personalities come across and make for interesting TV. Dr. Gregory House, for example, The Mentalist, Sheldon Cooper, all of these people, if you look at their symptoms, must fall somewhere on the spectrum, and we like laughing about it. Dyslexia. People who have dyslexia are battle processing the written word, but are exceptional with literacy, and they are creative and strategic thinkers. So workplaces should be looking at enhancing that. What's the difficulty with this in a workplace? Well, first of all, many of your employees don't understand or even know that they have or are on the spectrum in relation to a neurodiverse condition. And if they don't know that, they don't know that they can and should be accommodated. The other obvious difficulty is these things don't necessarily come up in the context of, hi, my name is X and I have a neurodiverse condition. Employers only ever pick up on the problem. The problem identifies itself in one or two ways. Either the employee is a poor performer because their workplace isn't suited to their personality, or more likely there are very obvious compatibility issues. People just can't interact with one another. Why? Because they don't understand the rules of social interaction because of a neurodiverse condition. So we would traditionally understand and unpack neurodiverse conditions by reacting in an incapacity process. And I don't really want to talk about that. Everyone that's on the webinar will understand how we deal with incapacity. We look at alternatives, we seek to manage those alternatives, and as a last resort, if there are no alternatives and the incapacity is debilitating and permanent, we would probably terminate the employment. I want to focus more on the proactive steps employers should be taking, and the law actually advocates that we must take. Because in many instances, a neurodiverse condition such as autism, ADHD, even Tourette's could amount to a disability under the Employment Equity Act. And of course, once it meets the definition of a disability, all sorts of other accommodation criteria apply under the Code of Good Practice for dealing with disabilities. Now remember, when we assess whether it's a disability under that code, we don't focus on the diagnosis. We focus on the impact of the condition on the workplace. So if your autism constitutes a barrier to entry or a barrier to promotion or success within a workplace, it may well be a disability. And that disability must be dealt with by reasonable accommodation. And we are enjoined to seek to ensure that a person is accommodated unless for you as an employer, it would amount to unjustified hardship. So the threshold is a lot higher than what it would be in an ordinary case of incapacity, because if we think particularly in white collar working environments, the extent to which employers are able to accommodate people is vast. When COVID-19 happened, many businesses moved seamlessly to a work from home environment. We can't suggest that we can't accommodate somebody with a neurodiverse condition, because we have accommodated lots of people to keep our businesses going throughout the COVID pandemic. If we are a designated employer, we've got to look at removing barriers in the workplace. How do we go about doing that? It's changing the way of thinking. We've done this in the context of gender identification and gender diversity in the workplace. We do it all the time. It's just about putting on our radar as employers the idea that this must happen in respect of neurodiverse conditions. What does it mean? Create awareness about neurodiverse conditions. If you create awareness, potentially you're going to have employees who will come forward and say, wait, hang on. I've listened to this now. It looks like I have this condition. It sounds like I have this condition. And you're telling me I'm battling in the workplace for the reasons associated with my condition. I want to be accommodated, rather than that conversation starting when you get a notice to attend an incapacity inquiry. We should have policies. We should have procedures. We should have standard ways of considering accommodating neurodiverse conditions. And in those proactive ways of trying to raise awareness for neurodiverse conditions, we should be encouraging courageous conversation amongst our workers. Ultimately, if I suffer from a neurodiverse condition, the stigma attached to that historically suggests that I don't talk about it. We talk about everything else in the workplace and we harp on about it, and we have mental wellness days. Nobody ever talks about the fact that some people are autistic. They have ADHD. They lash out. They can't cope in social settings. It's got nothing to do with them being grumpy or overworked. It's got to do with the fact that they don't understand, through no fault of their own, certain rules of social interaction that are very important to be successful in the workplace. And that channel of communication goes more than just between HR and the person with neurodiverse conditions. It should be training managers on how to deal with persons with neurodiverse conditions. It should potentially go to what are standard ways we can accommodate persons with neurodiverse conditions. Something as simple as, if you have ADHD, remove an employee from an open plan working environment. It seems so obvious, but it's not thought about. Why? Because nobody raises their hand and says, I battle in an open plan working environment. So the focus for me is not necessarily about what's going to happen when this goes wrong, because it can go wrong. Discrimination claims against employees who are potentially dismissed on the basis of their medical condition, those can all arise. It's not my focus. My focus is to say to employers, it is time that we put this in the same limelight as we do all the other things that are very topical in relation to diversity, because this is just simply another type of diversity. And if we don't, we will have to, because it is not 1990 anymore. Employees do not just shut up and put up. Employees now are prepared to call their employer out on all aspects, and it is just another one of those aspects. And we can't say that we are a diverse environment if we aren't able to or are not cognizant of the fact that that is included in neurodiverse conditions. It's not something that employers are absolutely on their own in relation to. There's a host of resources on the internet, and particularly in the UK, where this is a lot more advanced, that enjoin and encourage and assist employers with solving these answers. In a South African context, we have to solve those answers against the backdrop of what would an unjustified hardship be. And we can only understand what an unjustified hardship would be in our workplace if we know what's not an unjustified hardship. So we've got to start having these discussions between HR and between employees. Our employment equity committees, our transformation and diversity committees should be looking at, well, if this happens, aren't there subtle changes to our workplace that can be made in order to better accommodate persons with neurodiverse conditions? Fluorescent lighting, one of the most obvious ways to change a workplace that may better assist an employee who battles with ADHD or autism. It's not something that is also uncommon. It's roughly 15 to 20% of workplaces workplaces have roughly between 15 and 20% of employees who suffer with some form of neurodiverse condition, whether diagnosed or not. So we can't sit back and say, well, it's not really in my workplace. And if it is in my workplace, I've dealt with it under my employment equity plan, because we're going to look to get to a 2% on our disability report when we eventually get there on the 5-year plan. We can't say that because those disabilities are obvious and they're seen and they're addressed immediately. Neurodiverse conditions are not. And we need to look right at the outset. How are we hiring people in our recruitment processes? Because if you are interviewed as a person with a neurodiverse or social condition, you may be not kicked out of the interview, but kicked out for consideration simply on the basis that your first impression was an awkward one. We're human beings. That's how we recruit. You don't make that smiley-faced handshake, affable first impression, not because you're not an affable person, but because you don't understand how to do that in a workplace context. And I'm advocating for a workplace that says from start to finish, we're going to prevent this becoming an issue in the workplace by looking to accommodate, by looking to change our structures, and by looking to do exactly what we're doing in the workplace in relation to tolerance of gender diversity, tolerance of race, tolerance of all other aspects of the workplace that are diverse. This is just another one. I think I've about hit my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Brett. Yes, you have hit the 10-minute slot and really left us with a lot to think about. I mean, the point that sticks with me is how adaptable we are able to be if we choose to be. So it's as employers specifically. So a real challenge out there to employers. Thanks, Brett. The next input is going to come from Winnie. And Winnie's a senior CCMA commissioner and has written a number of awards relating to this topic specifically, and has been involved in thinking about it. So, and Winnie's also a consultant for PTF Business Consulting and is advising clients on how to deal with these issues. So, Winnie, over to you to speak to us more about sort of some of the consequences that have come out of not managing this issue well.
Right, thank you. Good morning. So Brett has focused quite a lot. Well, he's focused on neurodiversity, Whereas I must say what comes across our desks is more the question of actual mental illness, and where it's more of identified as an illness rather than a diversity. And I'm going to be looking more at some of the consequences if it isn't managed well. But so what we're seeing is it most often manifests as some sort of the person suffering anxiety and depression in the workplace. So, but I think what I say would apply similarly to any of the neurodiverse conditions that Brett has referred to. So it's just that we're seeing it most often arise as anxiety and depression. Very often we see that it comes from the employees alleging that the line manager is the trigger, and that there are elements of victimization, but it can also stem from both work-related circumstances and personal circumstances. So it's a complex thing. There can be various triggers. Someone can have experienced mental illness or anxiety or depression in the past, and then suffers perhaps a traumatic event, which triggers it. Or it can be a gradual progression and be slowly escalating to the point that it becomes unmanageable for the person, and very often then also for the organization. I'm not going to go into the causes, but what we are seeing is as part of these manifestations, that it comes out in various types of cases. So we're seeing it in misconduct cases where perhaps there's unauthorized absence from work or insubordination. We're seeing it in poor performance cases, incapacity cases, again, absence from work, missing of meetings, missing deadlines, lacking motivation, and not completing tasks. We also see it in actual ill health, which is where there's actually a sick certificate. And very often associated here is the exhaustion of sick leave. And then interestingly, we also see it in constructive dismissal cases. This refers usually to that situation that I've mentioned where the employee is saying that it's my line manager who's picking on me and causing this immense stress at work, and to the point that I eventually resign. So we're seeing it in constructive dismissal cases. And generally, we're seeing an increase in grievances, claims of harassment and victimization in the workplace. So that obviously falls under unfair discrimination and even automatically unfair dismissals. So it's the whole range that we're seeing it in almost all our types of dismissal cases. Also unfair labor practices, but it tends to be more coming to us after the employee's actually gone through the whole process. We also see it in procedural fairness aspects where employees might be booked off for when they're facing a disciplinary hearing, and how employers should deal with that situation, because they obviously now want that hearing to run, and then the employee claims that they are suffering from stress and anxiety, and they get booked off for the time period in which the hearing should be held. So it really is, there's no question that it's become exceptionally prevalent. And this has obviously resulted in arbitration awards, and also the Labour Court has also had opportunity to pronounce on it. So far, there's been less from the Labour Court and more arbitrations on the issue. But an important Labour Court case was Nkosinati Mokomatsi versus Lillian Gorodema and others. The employee in this case was suffering from depression and acute anxiety. And there were elements of alleged misconduct, and the employee resigned in that context, and then claimed constructive dismissal. And then the commissioner found that the applicant had resigned voluntarily, and that he wasn't constructively dismissed. When it got to the Labour Court found that the arbitrator had not allowed the employee to fully air the impact of his mental illness. So both at the stage that he was facing the charges of misconduct, so internally by the employer, and at the arbitration stage, the commissioner had said, this is off the point. We're going into the charges of misconduct. We need to focus on the resignation and whether it was voluntary. And the court said very specifically that arbitrators need to hear that evidence. That's part of hearing his full side of the story, because it led and contributed to his resignation, and it could have been managed in other ways. So that's an important case. The Labour Court held that what applies is the reasonable employee standard, which of course is what applies in any constructive dismissal case. But what it said, that while we do have an objective test, which is the reasonable employee, we need to look at the reasonable employee with that mental ill health. So it's a slightly subjective objective test, so to speak. It's got elements of subjectivity. So you take a reasonable employee with that mental illness, and how would that person have managed in the situation? Would that person then have come to the conclusion that a continued employment relationship was intolerable? And so the learning there is really that both in the internal stages, at internal hearings, or in managing these matters internally, and at arbitration, the due regard must be given to the possibility that misconduct may be the result of a mental illness. And it therefore, requires more tolerance and more leniency to be applied. And then we're also seeing at arbitrations, we're seeing quite a lot of cases there. I have a number of cases that I could refer to, and but I think to go through 5 or 6 cases would be overwhelming and impossible in my 10 minutes. But perhaps just to touch on a case I did fairly recently, the employee had, he claimed he'd been persecuted and victimized by his line manager for some time. And he had actually lodged some grievances on that before some terrible tragedy struck. And what happened in his situation was that his brother, who was his favorite sibling, committed suicide. And he was required to go and, well, I think he found the body, and he had to help, it was by hanging, and he had to help take down the body of his brother. And then less than 2 months later, it still brings tears to my eyes. Less than 2 months later, his son committed suicide on his birthday by again hanging. And again, this time he wasn't present at the time, but he was called again to go and help take the body down. So you can imagine the trauma that this man went through. The company was expressed, they expressed sympathy and so on, but they did very little to actually be sympathetic to his condition. And he started to get booked off for stress and anxiety. And he was still expected to be at meetings. He didn't get any special leave, and gradually exhausted all his. So he was, seeing psychiatrists and psychologists and being booked off. But gradually he exhausted all that. And then he was required to attend meetings, and there were various operational requirements that the manager was insisting that he met. So he eventually ended up referring 3 cases to the CCMA. There was an unfair labor practice, an unfair dismissal, and a discrimination case. And I actually found in his favor in all aspects, except that by the time he was dismissed, it was confirmed that he could no longer perform his work. So on substantive fairness, I found in favor of the company, but the procedure that had been followed was problematic. And I also found that there had been a form of discrimination on the basis of a disability, as well as unfair labor practices, because he was issued with some final warnings, even in that desperate stage when he was trying to recover from the stress and anxiety. So he was diagnosed with sorry, I forget the term, okay, it's the type of depression that's really the most serious. I'm sure the term will come back to me. So, those are just two cases. In that case, it appears, I don't think it's been taken on review, which in some cases we don't like to be reviewed, but in some cases it's a way in which these matters can ultimately get more into the public eye, and we can get pronouncements from the Labour Court. But I think that the company has paid the compensation that was ordered. Obviously, reinstatement wasn't appropriate. All right. So am I running out of time?
Yeah.
I am. Am I out of time, or can I wrap up?
You want to wrap up, please, Winnie?
Okay. So I think just some of the learnings is that if mental illness is claimed, it must be taken into consideration. Doctors' reports must be considered and taken seriously. There have been cases where doctors make recommendations, for example, working from home, and then, no action is actually taken to do that. Where it's necessary and the employer doesn't trust the employee's doctors, do a referral to the employer's doctor where it's appropriate and get another opinion. Also, there have been outcomes from employees' wellness programs where the wellness program, the psychologist, for example, makes recommendations and the employer fails to implement its own recommendations from its own wellness programs. We cannot be paying lip service to these kind of things. Our wellness programs, employee assistance programs, and so on, even our mental health circulars that go out need to be taken seriously, and we need to live by, to walk the talk, so to speak. And perhaps I should end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. What always strikes me is when we hear about cases, how it just brings the people back into focus on these issues. And hearing the stories is always just really poignant. Thank you very much, Winnie, for that. Winnie has also suggested that we make those cases available to all the attendees after the webinar. So I see there has been a question relating to that. So we'll send links to those after the webinar, as well as to the presentations, the full presentations that our panelists are speaking to in a very, very short 10 minutes. So thanks, Winnie. Our next panelist up is Angela Duplessis. Angela is interesting in many ways, but in this instance specifically because she comes from a industrial and organizational and occupational social work background. So she's been thinking about these issues, as she reminded us, early 80s, and has then worked in large organizations trying to pioneer that work, and is now doing a lot of mediation and facilitation around some of these issues too. So Angela, over to you.
Thanks, Marion. Okay, well, I just wanted to start off with a personal reflection. I entered, and Marion's right, in 1980. I was appointed the social worker in a small town called Oranienburg, which had the richest diamond gem mine in the world at that stage, as the social worker. And in those days, there was a huge amount of ignorance and, quite frankly, hostility towards the idea of a mental health practitioner. People kept asking me, why are you here? What value can you add? We kind of don't get it. And those early days, we tended to focus on the obvious problems in the community. And boy, I could have written a book on that. Addictions, gender-based violence, trauma, family issues, etc. And the major rationale for our services and employing social workers, at one stage there were many social workers in occupational settings, was the cost to the employer of having people with addictions. I must say Sanka played a very pivotal role in this in the early employee assistance programs, but we focused on arguing to employees it costs a lot not to attend to people's personal problems. Right. But over time, of course, the obvious became clear that mental health and the workplace were a kind of a two-way street. In other words, mental health issues impacted on the workplace, and the opposite was true. The workplace impacted hugely sometimes on employees' mental health. And we used to call this a focus on employee as person or person as employee, and we wanted as social workers to have that broad focus on both of those, not only personal problems. My experience made me and a lot of my fellow colleagues in the field all those years ago, and as the years have passed, come to understand that the most common dynamics that impacted on employee well-being fell into four major categories. Poor leadership, and I've got some humdinger examples of this in a chapter that I've written recently. So poor leadership, sexual harassment, including, bullying and the abuse of power at the workplace, incompatibility, as Brett has outlined, racial discrimination, stereotyping, unconscious bias, and microaggressions. A lot of that leads to anxiety and depression. So in doing a lot of the conflict resolution mediation work that I do, I stumbled on a couple of learnings. First of all, often there is a misalignment between a person, often the supervisor or leader, manager, their intent and the impact that they have on people, which create unhealthy, harmful patterns of interaction. And often the impacted subordinate who has this harmful response, well, the behavior is seen as a microaggression or inappropriate or offensive in some way, doesn't feel able to give the feedback, exactly what Brett said, in the form of a courageous conversation. We often find people who have got problems at work and try and bring it out. The conversations get stuck at that kind of battle of messages stage, the blame game or swapping positional stances versus the less visible agenda of interests, needs, fears and concerns, what really is troubling that person. The blame game is also comes into blaming people for behavior at work. And of course, the third dynamic being the reluctance of people often to share, to admit to mental health issues in the workplace for fear of rejection and ridicule. So we have all witnessed over a period of about 15 years or so how dealing with mental health issues have become far more acceptable, especially during and post-COVID. So what can mediation, and Marion asked me to talk about this, what can mediation as a form of alternative dispute resolution offer? And I'm just giving you a few thoughts in the interest of time. First of all, in sum, I think what it offers is a non-adversarial approach. So instead of facing disciplinary inquiry and disciplinary action for absenteeism, poor performance, and other forms of incapacity, we can have a non-adversarial problem-solving approach. For example, people often don't want to take matters forward around bullying, harassment, whatever the sensitive issue may be, because they don't want to face cross-examination during a disciplinary inquiry. And I think mediation can offer a relatively non-judgmental stance where you focus on the joint contribution of the employee and often peers or their supervisor, leader, as opposed to blaming, as I've mentioned before. And just my final 3 points here are, I think that in a mediation process, obviously we were relying on the mediator being skilled, will demonstrate respect and understanding of diversity and difference and its impact on this particular set of circumstances that we're dealing with. and dealing sensitively with issues that impact on people's self-esteem and identity. And then finally, of course, maintaining all parties' dignity and trying to find a win-win situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. That was very quick. You're well under time, so we didn't need to manage any time in that instance. I mean, I think the takeaway there for me is just the issue around sensitivity and how one deals with these issues sensitively and probably thoroughly from both perspectives, that of the employer and the employee, and a real challenge there for leadership and leading the way in how you deal with these issues.
And Marion, it's that balance that we talk a lot about when we're teaching around incapacity and so on, is the balance between employment justice and the operational needs of an employer. So all of us who are employees have to be able to fulfill our contractual duties at the end of the day. But of course, Brett's point is so pertinent, where necessary, reasonable accommodation.
Right. And then also tying into Winnie's point about what that reasonable accommodation is within the definition of someone who has mental illness challenges. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Angela. Our last panelist up is Amandla. Amandla is very familiar to all of us because we work a lot with her. She's in one of our videos, so we know her well. But Amanda, more importantly, is an associate at Bowman's and has kind of stumbled onto this area of wellness in the workplace by working with her colleagues and her associates on these issues. So that's just a fascinating story about how it can be accommodated in the workplace. But Amanda is going to speak to us about a way of breaking down the barriers and encouraging those courageous conversations that Angela referred to. So Amanda, over to you.
Thank you, Marion, and good morning, everyone. This is probably not the best place to start, but since we're here, I'll just say it. We as employers and employees create toxic workplaces, whether knowingly or unknowingly. It is our inability to embrace diversity of thought, of behavior, of each other that hinders us from having healthy workplaces and instead breeds resistance and strife, as mentioned by all the panelists. We often work in teams, and as such, it is important that we now unlearn the way we interact with each other and adopt an interaction approach based on understanding, compassion, and the desire to achieve a common goal. During my research, it showed that to date, a typical team in the South African context comprised of at least 3 generations out of the 5 generations that are currently in our workplaces. All these generations are diverse and they have diverse experiences and respond differently to life situations, including the workplace. And as a caveat, before I go any further, this conversation is not at all calculated to promote age discrimination, but to explore the wealth of our workplaces to better safeguard our mental health. So without
Oh, Amanda, sorry, just to interrupt you. I think you've just gone on to mute.
Am I back now?
You're back, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Marion. So a traditionalist demographic has extensive work experience, the people we look up to as experts in the field. And they're still in our workplaces, although they're working past their retirement age. So they see engagement in our workplaces as an opportunity to transfer knowledge and skill. And since they existed before technology, they really value face-to-face communication and an understanding of how they want to be approached and communicated to will help everyone in the team. Moreover, these team members have age-related issues, such as your audio and visual impairments, and they've suffered bereavement over the period of years. So how they experience the workplace and how they experience life in general will obviously be diverse and different from how somebody younger experiences life. So in this regard, research shows that patience and humility from team members would benefit traditionalists, and they will be more able to provide that knowledge transfer and skills development. On the other hand, we've got baby boomers who see their careers as translating into self-worth, but they are faced with the looming retirement. Therefore, this looming retirement also means the prospects of employment in the near future are significantly reduced. In this instance, research finds that baby boomers are at a high suicide risk, and they don't talk about it because they exist in a generation and a time where talking about mental health was taboo. So the stigmatization, the stereotyping, they keep their mental health issues at heart and they don't speak about it. So giving baby boomers the opportunity to teach and engaging with them in a compassionate manner with empathy and reassuring them that they still add value, and then and reassuring them that retirement does not necessarily mean that that's the end of their self-worth, but then it's the beginning of something new. And as traditionalists, they can still re-enter the workplace and still teach. The next generation we have is the Generation X's, who find careers to be who they are. They are currently in leadership positions all across the global spectrum, but also have another role, which is giving care for their young ones or their aging parents. So they have a dual role of leading our organizations and leading at home as well. This undoubtedly has significant impact on their mental health. And so the support they need ranges from creating a workplace that embraces work-life balance, flexibility, your agility approaches, and they value constructive feedback because they always seek to improve on how they are seen as other people or other team members. Millennials, on the other hand, see careers as an opportunity to contribute to society and to something that's big and that is going to grow and take foot. That's going to change how the world operates. They see a workplace that promotes equitable treatment and transparency, and they are not afraid to jump ship to pursue what they seek. The Generation Z, which is the last generation in our workplace, believes careers to be an investment, and so desire to be allowed the independence to flex their entrepreneurial muscle. It is important to note that both millennials and Generation Z battle with self-esteem owing to the increased exposure to social media and the idea of what success should look like. And their financial health issues are significant as the economy is constantly moving against them. So mentorship will benefit both these age demographics. It is important to note that all these 5 generations at one point were at the same age. When they started working, they were at that same particular age, but because of life differences and where the context of which they grew up or they entered the workplace has changed over the years, how they engage with each other is completely different. So you would find that a traditionalist still wants you to come to the office to give you an instruction, while a millennial would just send you a text. So it is important to note those dynamics in our teams and find ways to engage and really harness those relationships in the team. And it is important to also keep in mind that when we don't embrace generational diversity, we expose ourselves to increased ethical lapses such as theft, dishonesty, conflicts of interest, where people are even thinking of migrating or are quiet quitting all of those issues. And we've got increased harassment cases. We have a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunications between management and employees, which are obviously deleterious to the performance of the company or the individual, the productivity of the company or the organization as a whole. And it also affects good decision-making because there's always this panic and anxiety. So to just add in a bit of law into that, employers have an obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to maintain, as far as reasonable practicable, a working environment that is safe and without risk to the health of the employees, as Brett and Winnie have touched on. But employees also have a responsibility to look out for their own safety and that of their colleagues. And this is where I believe courageous conversations come into place. But I'll get to that in a moment. We also have the Employment Equity Act that places an obligation on employers to prevent and eliminate unfair discrimination in the workplace. We have now seen how mental health issues can now be seen to be discrimination on the basis of disability. But there is another way it could be seen as discrimination on the basis of age because of that misunderstanding caused by the lack of appreciation that we approach things differently based on how we grew up and how we experienced life. There are a number of ways to comply with both the Occupational Health and Safety Act as well as the Employment Equity Act, such as implementing the five languages of appreciation in the workplace to change the culture into a more individual-based approach. I have done this with a group of juniors that were in my company, and we did the link. It's a 15-minute link. You do the link, and then it gives you the results as to what is your primary love language, but in the workplace, we call that language of appreciation. So this approach requires an understanding of how an individual would like to be interacted with, and this is on a daily basis. And it requires us to be intentional about the change we want to see in our workplaces and in the teams that we work with. So to be effective, each language of appreciation should be one that each team member truly appreciates and not just based on our personal assumptions. The first one is the words of affirmation. So people who align themselves with that language of appreciation would really benefit if the affirmation is specific and there's constant feedback that is constructive, and where there's something that they've done particularly well, that acknowledgement is made public. And then there's the second one is quality time, which should be undivided, intentional, and in a safe space, because the individual needs to feel that everything that they say to you is confidential, and it won't now then be taken to HR or be the basis upon which they are dismissed. Then this particular language of appreciation then opens up a space for people to talk to us about their mental health issues without feeling that there's a risk, there's a career risk they're placing on themselves. And the third one is acts of service, which is basically lending support to the particular team member. And whenever you lend support, make sure that whatever task that you do, you complete it. Because if you do not, then you've just landed more problems on this person's plate. The fourth one is tangible gifts, which should be thoughtful and address the individual's needs or wants. The last one, the most contentious one, is physical touch. Physical touch does not necessarily mean you now engaging in an appropriate manner, but it should be appropriate in the workplace context and with consent. And it is usually in spontaneous celebratory moments like a high five, a fist bump, a handshake. So it shouldn't be something that really raises sexual harassment issues. Thank you, Marion, for the time update. I'm almost done. So following the implementation of the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace, there will be noticeable benefits for both the team and the organization as a whole. Performance will increase to optimal levels. There'll be adherence to policies. Employees would want to engage in the implementation or the amendments of policies. There's going to be increased turnover because the staff is healthy and is well and is willing to come to work. There's going to be improved overall health, which then creates an opportunity to reinvest the contributions we'll be making to medical aid. So it's also feeding into the financial health of your employees. And companies who can attest to the implementation or the successful implementation of 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace, range from Microsoft, Forbes, the US Air Force, the Princeton University, and Chick-fil-A. So there are organizations that are established that have already implemented this and continue to advocate for the implementation of the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace as a start to having courageous conversations without really expending a lot of money into training people and bringing in a whole entire team for diversity discussions, which end up in the boardroom or wherever they discuss and never necessarily implemented. But with this approach, everybody knows what each other's preferred language of appreciation is, and there's daily practice of that. There's an intention behind that. So that's how we can change the culture. That's one of the ways we can change the culture and start really on implementing courageous conversations in our daily lives and appreciating each other and seeing each other as individuals who have individual lives other than just cogs in a machine. So thank you, Marion.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That's fascinating and interesting to hear that this is being implemented and is a way of I guess what strikes me from all the conversations that we've heard of now is there's a big kind of push to make the circle bigger, incorporate neurodiversity, generational diversity, individual preference, and just kind of creating workplaces that are probably more well, but also more complex in many ways. So fascinating inputs. Thank you very much. Good. I mean, I think you've all been listening probably with a lot of attention to this. There are some questions in the chat that have come up. Some of them have been answered by the presenters themselves. The first question relates to that was put up here was, should employees, if known, be declaring their neurodiverse conditions? So that's one for you, Brett, just to keep in mind while you get into a discussion among each other, the 4 panelists here. I know you've all got questions of each other, and the first person to have a question is Brett. You've just been listening to Amanda, and I think you have a question for her.
Maybe before I ask my question, let me just address the question because it's a very pertinent point. There's 2 aspects to this. One, an employee needs to understand that they have a neurodiverse condition and they need to understand the consequences of that. But you can't disclose something you don't know about, or when you don't feel you're in an environment where your disclosure will be met with the right amount of accommodation and sensitivity. So as employers, we need to be creating that environment. So when it does come up, and increasingly people are being diagnosed, particularly with autism and ADHD, as 30 or 40-year-olds, because they've worked these things out, is we as employers must encourage the disclosure. And if not encourage full disclosure, at least encourage an environment where people get to talk about how they feel in the workplace. Because a lot of time, my telling you how I'm experiencing the workplace is me telling you I have a neurodiverse condition without calling it by name, simply because my experience is dictated to by how I appreciate the social setting of the workplace. Then to my question, I'm fascinated by these love languages because personally, I sit sort of in the middle of those generations when it comes to a workplace. And what I wanted to ask Amanda is, when you look at those generations, if we call a spade, certain of them are more capable of embracing change than others. So the younger generations are quick to embrace change in the workplace. The traditionalists who I started working with do not like it. How have you seen and experienced the reaction to these kind of things in the elder generation? Because you can't embrace this if your leaders don't. So what is the reaction when you when a more junior employee goes to their boss or their supervisor and says, listen, I know you've never heard of these things before unless your wife made you sit through the link. I want to discuss our love languages and I want to work to it. What is the reaction that you generally met with?
I'll start from my team. I'm the youngest of the team. So when I started exploring this with the new candidate attorneys and I spoke to my team about it, it was like, interesting. And that was it. But when they saw the Saslo presentation and how everything worked, the reception, and really, really thought about how this could affect our team, then they started paying attention to it. And come performance review time, they're hearing from the juniors, they're hearing themselves give feedback to the juniors. And they're now thinking about it more to say, okay, there is something here. So although I haven't implemented with them, but then according to my research, yes, traditionalists will resist change because if it's not broken, don't fix it. But remember, leadership, I believe leadership to be a two-way street. In as much as we believe in a hierarchical sort of leadership, there's also a horizontal way of leadership where you can teach, I don't want to say the old dog, new tricks, but it's something like that because there is an interest. They're also adapting to the changing world. They've embraced technology. They're no longer walking around with telephones. They have cell phones now. So there is an embracing of change to a certain context, but we also have to be willing to put in the work to say, okay, and you don't have to be aggressive about it. It's also how you approach each generation. Hence, it's important to have an understanding. To a traditionalist that values face-to-face interactions, you go to them and you start having this conversation. And it's how you approach people that makes them succumb to the charm of what you're trying to achieve. So approach really matters. And if you really don't understand what the position of the next person is, your approach may have very little effect. Like he's saying, from somebody who doesn't know that they have neurodiversity, but you're having a conversation during your quality time with them, and you notice because you are paying attention, you notice that this is what's happening here. This is the underlying condition that causes this individual to come across this way. Then that's how this works. You've listened, you've given that person what they needed, and you got your answers, and now you're able to find an approach that works better in your workplace and that works better for your team, and create a safe space for all the team members based on what they prefer, and having engaged with them prior to having these courageous conversations. Because if you do that nice little team activity, then you know that Brett prefers words of affirmation, Angela prefers physical touch, then you will be able to start implementing that. But it all starts with an intentional desire to understand an individual as an individual. Don't know whether that answers you, Brett.
I think it does.
Amandla, there's been a question on the chat. Just what are the 5 languages of appreciation, of workplace appreciation? If you could just rattle them all for us. You've just mentioned 2, but if you could.
Sorry, Marion, thank you. That's words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, tangible gifts, and physical touch.
And each of us have a preference, and it's about finding out or understanding your own preference, which is probably a challenge itself, and then finding out the preferences of your team or your colleagues, and
yes,
relating to them in that way.
Yes, and the quiz takes less than 15 minutes, and it's free. So that's the beauty of it.
Right, Amandla, will you put the link to the tool, I guess, in the chat so that we can share it, share the love, so to speak.
I will.
Okay, great. Thank you. Brett, does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up for Amanda?
Yes, thank you. Far more than I thought it would be answered, actually. Wow.
Great, excellent. Good. I mean, Angela, you've indicated you've got a question for Brett.
Yes, Brett, I really, really enjoyed your presentation. I mean, labor lawyers very often don't have a great deal of sensitivity to the underneath the table, beneath the iceberg, and issues, and it's the less visible issues. And it's so lovely to meet someone, and I hope you're being very influential amongst your colleagues, not only at Webber Wentzel, but other labor law firms as well. I just wanted to ask you, so many managers spend a whole lot of their time and energy managing so-called, what we normally would call troubled employees, and not even other diversities and personal issues. How receptive have you found, or maybe your colleagues have found, employers to your message?
We're all receptive to these messages. It's because it's quite easy to talk the talk. It's a very easy thing to say we want to do, and it's a very different discussion when we actually get faced with the situation. And I think employers increasingly are going to be faced with the situation where somebody walks in, to example, their interview and says upfront, I am the best person for this job, but I have autism, so I need to work this job for you in one way or another. So I think we are certainly very receptive, because employers generally, and particularly in South Africa, are very understanding of we can't be diverse in ways we want to be diverse. We have to be, if we talk the talk of diversity, we've got to be diverse in all spheres. I think where the reception is maybe a little bit more difficult is in the actual implementation, particularly of accommodation. Why? Because it may require more management time. It may require financial resources. And traditionally in workplaces, you sometimes avoid a problem by just creating another one, and it kicks the can down the road. And I think that's one of the things that we need to overcome, is to say, well, if we're spending so much time, and if you think more so than the love languages, we look at the Myers-Briggs, and there's all sorts of ways of understanding our workplaces, we could just as easily be understanding this through engagement, such that we can raise these things with employees. We see the consequences in the workplace, and if we see those consequences, we should be having discussions to say, have you been to the right doctors? Are you seeing the right people? Our ICAS and our EAP services should be picking up on these things and referring people to the right way. It is, to my mind, something we've got to change from talking the talk to walking the walk. And that's not happening yet. It's very much a nice thing to talk about, and it sounds kind of cool. But when somebody walks in and says, I have autism and I want the job, are we actually going to consider and embrace that, or are they going to be dismissed out of hand as an applicant because we fear them to be a problem child?
If you just think, Brett, of some of the really famous, well-known people, from Elon Musk to Einstein and so on, who have had autism, I hear exactly what you're saying, that to actually walk the walk can be a challenge.
And remember, the other thing that is quite prevalent to my mind, certainly, and particularly having grown up in a law firm, is we don't discuss neurodiverse conditions because those persons are high performers. When you're a high performer, it's not broke, don't fix it. But why, even as a high performer, am I not entitled to a measure of accommodation? And pre-COVID, we wouldn't have thought of that. Now I'm sitting and looking, you're forcing me to come back into the office where I have to engage with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis, and I hate it. I don't want to. And because I was high-performing at home, I want to stay as high-performing at home. Let me work at home. It's a simple thing. And we don't realize that more so accommodating persons who have disclosed it and who are battling in the workplace, we should also be looking to create a workplace which fosters that in our high performers.
Interesting.
Great, thanks, Angela. Two of the lawyers in the room, I guess, as well, is Amandla, you have some questions for Winnie, but what does strike me about this conversation is generally how there are always kind of two parties or more than one person that has certain roles and certain responsibilities in terms of that employment relationship. And my question, just to go on, Brett, from Angela's question, is, and maybe start kind of getting Winnie to think about this area as well, is how do you, I think the reality is that some cases are going to end up at the CCMA and potentially at the Labour Court. And how do you actually, how much of an effort do you think needs to be put in to avoid that in a way? So managing these conflicts or tensions earlier, how much effort will it require from any organization, small or large, to set up those systems and do the necessary kind of change management to incorporate this level of diversity?
It's a lot of work, but we worked that pretty quickly. We got COVID-19 policies in place in a matter of hours because we had to, because it was important and it kept our business going. Certainly in professional environments, if we want to retain talent, we can't let this become a problem. We have to embrace it. And it's not as difficult as one might think. It looks and feels like a lot, and it's another burden on an HR practitioner. But effectively, all it is just reassessing your existing disability policies, your existing incapacity policies, your existing employee wellness programs, and saying, well, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to change how that wheel turns. And I'm going to add things into it. I mean, every single day in a professional environment, you're getting some talk or some webcast about how certain things are managed in the workplace. This is just another thing that must be on the radar. I think what's important for me when it comes to how do we avoid, or what do we need to do in order to avoid this going to court? They are going to go to court. But I tell my clients, and I manage persons on the basis, if this is going to go to court, will I be able to sleep at night after getting to the witness box? And if I'm satisfied that I'll sleep at night after going to the witness box because I did what I could, well, then how much more can I really do? And I think that means very fast or very early reactions and proper conversations in the beginning so that we're working together, because at least once we've worked together, if it's still if it goes to hell in a handbasket, well, then we know we started from the right place. And of course, the Labour Court quite likes it when an employer starts in the right place with the right intention. And I think that's all we can really do, because we wouldn't make money if we were able to resolve all of these things in the workplace.
Yeah. It does kind of raise the flag of kicking the can, to HR or to employee relations in every instance. And there seems to be, based on what Angela's saying and Amandla's saying about taking care of employees, there seems to be a real challenge of that leadership, managers, supervisors, having those relationships, being very aware of the needs of their team members.
I think one thing that struck a chord for me with Amandla is this leadership being a two-way street. We forget, because we spend so much of our time trying to reaffirm and reassure and give credit to juniors and to our team that we supervise, that we lose sight of the fact of how good we feel when one of our juniors walks up to us or one of our subordinates walks up to us and says, you know what, that was really out of the box thinking and I quite liked it. I'm enjoying learning from you. It makes us feel 100%, but we've lost sight of that because we're so busy keeping our head above water and trying to manage our juniors and tell them and make them feel important. That embracing this change as managers means that we're going to get feedback. We're going to get the other, it's going to push back at us in a good way as well.
Great.
If I can just come in there, I think that what we often see is there's been an issue. So now HR typically will embark on a process and they start to walk that process, which is of course important. But it almost then becomes tunnel vision of we're walking down this road and that's where we're going to end with this employee, instead of perhaps remaining more open to the chance of almost some side roads coming in, of alternatives, of fresh approaches, of different ways of dealing with the problem, instead of now, we're on the incapacity route, let's go this route and to its logical end. And I think that there's a lot of scope there for remaining open to different influences, different ways of seeing things, and different approaches and solutions to the problem. And I think that also ties in maybe with what I was going to ask Angela in a moment. But yes, so as much as I think one needs to remain open, what we've also seen is that employers often walk that process. They go down the whole incapacity route, and at the final moment, when it counts most, become impatient and unfairly dismiss the person because it's just now got too much. Maybe don't wait for the sick certificate to lapse before actually holding that hearing, because they just don't want to postpone it. They now want that person out. So, as much as the process is important, we can't be too single-minded. Shall I go on then, Marion, to the question that I had for Angela?
Absolutely.
So, what I've come across, and I also mediate in some of these cases besides arbitrating, and what one finds quite often, and I'm sure you'll relate, Angela, is that there might be, and it refers to what I'd said right at the beginning, there might be this sort of claim or tension between two individuals. One maybe reports to the other, and there's a claim of victimization. And then similarly, there might be a claim of, but you're not, you're not cooperating. So the two are in, let's just take two employees, they're in clear conflict. Maybe even it's a grievance against the other one and a complaint against the other one. And then you're brought in as a mediator to try and get to, when you speak to the one, what they say makes sense. And you're like, yeah, I'm with you on this. And when you speak to the other one, you also, I see your perspective, I'm with you on this. How do you break through? Can you give us some techniques on how you actually break through that kind of logging of heads? We both insist that they're right, and you can actually see that they are right in certain respects. How do you break through?
That was a conundrum for the 4,500 disputes I did as a CCMA commissioner when it first opened. You listen to the one version, totally compelling, listen to the other, totally compelling. Okay, what works for me is simply getting from positions, slightly more complicated, but let's take it at a simplest form. Getting from the iceberg battle of messages, the visible, the positional stuff, and going down, diving beneath the water with the parties to see that, in fact, although they look as if they've got nothing in common, if you have an honest conversation, a courageous conversation about needs, fears, interests, and concerns, you can often totally unlock what seems like a very adversarial, nothing in common dispute, and see that they both actually have the same fears, etc. And I find that the anatomy of a difficult conversation, that you're dealing with facts, the what really happened conversation, you're dealing with feelings, but you're also dealing with the impact on people's sense of identity, self-esteem, and so on, is very important in those conversations. And I've had some really good and unexpected outcomes where I do all of that deep diagnostic work before I put the parties together, because I see them individually, and really come out with some astonishing results. But I've also had a couple of sexual harassment cases, probably only two, where mediation didn't go down well at all. In trying to find common ground with two very different versions, I tried my best, and they made up, but there's been long-term effects to that relationship in that particular workplace.
Yeah, so I think the message is, mediation sometimes, well, very often works, but one can't, it's as a colleague of mine always used to say, if you've got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail.
Yes.
So it's only one tool, and there can be others.
Yeah.
Are appropriate.
In fact, what I want to do, I'm just busy with a project at the moment, but once I've got a bit more free time, I've got a really wonderful article that I'd like to summarize and put on the Conflict Dynamics website in terms of a critique of using mediation for sexual harassment cases. That particularly is challenging. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think, Amandla, you're the only person who haven't had a question, but I think I may have stolen your question. Have you still got a question for any of your colleagues?
Just one, most of which have been really answered. So by the end of last year, Winnie, there was a plethora of labor court cases where they were making determinations where employees had been dismissed for having found to be smoking weed or cannabis in the workplace, or traces of THC have been found on their systems. I just had a thought. Could this in any way be related to the mental health stresses that they're experiencing at work? Is that something that you've come across in your work, that employees use as a defense to say, we are under strenuous pressure? And how is that regulated going forward, if there's any intentions of regulating that? Is it substance abuse issue or mental health issue? I know it's a loaded question.
That's a curveball. Yeah, certainly it's been topical. And obviously people have such different approaches. The one being, is it really relevant to your work? Does it really, if you are using, does it really deter your performance? And isn't that the ultimate test? And then the other being the approach of a no tolerance approach, which is often adopted in companies, for example, where there's use of machinery. There's a no tolerance and people can be randomly tested, or if it's in the case of alcohol, at the point of entry, through breathalyzers and so on. So obviously these different ways of managing it, and I guess, like with most things, it needs to be a rational response. The Labour Court has said these policies need to be a rational response to the risk that the conduct poses to the employer's business. And so I guess that if we continue to apply that test, then that can address some of the issues. But certainly I haven't had it come across it, but I do think we could experience cases where someone says it's prohibited, but for my mental illness, perhaps to sleep at night, or for my way of dealing with my mental illness, I actually need the substance. And perhaps it could even be backed up by a medical report. And then we need to be open to engaging on that, because as the cases have already demonstrated, we can't ignore those defenses. And so we would certainly have to hear it at the internal stage, and it would need to be taken into account if it got to arbitration. So I hope that addresses your tricky question.
Great.
We still have a long way to go, but I agree. Thank you.
Never a dull moment, always something interesting on the horizon. Okay, I think we've kind of reached the end. So I'd really like to give all the panelists an opportunity to, in a minute, just give us a final message. You've given us so much already, but Amandla, can I start with you?
Sure. So for me, my takeaway from this whole entire engagement is that courageous conversations have a space anyway in our lives, at our workplaces, during mediation, even at court, because that's the core way we get to understand what's really happening with the person. And to Brett's point, we really need to start walking the walk. We've done the talking, now let's start implementing and being intentional about it. And intentional does not necessarily mean now everything is permissible, but then everything has to be done within reason. But we still need to show that we are willing to embrace each other as colleagues, as employees, and as employers for the better of our workplaces and the better of our mental health going forward.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Marion.
Angela.
Yeah, I would just like to emphasize a point that I think Winnie and maybe Brett brought up. We teach a lot, Marion, through conflict dynamics about why it's so important to differentiate between misconduct and incapacity, because they have totally different approaches. And something that Vanessa Burta, the training manager, really emphasized for me, and it's made such sense, and I can see it making sense in terms of the training I'm doing in the mining industry at the moment, is if you don't know whether you're dealing with incapacity or misconduct, rather err on the side of going the problem-solving approach. Because don't ever find yourself needing to reverse out of a disciplinary process, because there's such damage to the relationship between the person and the subordinate, and also, of course, the credibility of the system, of the disciplinary system will be, put in jeopardy. So just that's my final thought. Really enjoyed talking today, and so conscious, Marion, of what you said about our circle around diversity is getting broader and broader, which is a great challenge going forward.
Great. Thank you, Angela. Winnie.
So I think that as much as we need to be open to new approaches and new ways of dealing with things, and we've heard about courageous conversations, and spoken about different ways of seeing this problem and trying to address it. I think there's also value in going back to some of the basics, and that is just to get familiar with refamiliarize ourselves with the codes of good practice on disability, and then also on the prevention and elimination of harassment in the workplace. These all touch on this area. There's a lot of good stuff and a lot of guidance to employers on how to deal with these things, especially in the concept around reasonable accommodation. So back to basics, but also open to new ideas.
Lovely.
Thanks, Winnie. Great. Thank you. Brett.
I think my takeaway when I was preparing to update my paper is going to be not law at all. I listened to a poem, and I'm going to get really soppy, but I listened to a poem by a poet called Morgan Harper Nichols, who was diagnosed with autism in her 30s. And she spoke about living with autism as being such that you live in a world where the rules are written in invisible ink. And no matter what you do, you can never read and never understand those rules. And then when you finally think you've read and understood them, somebody tells you, but actually they aren't really rules. It was just something we told you to keep you in employment, or to keep you in your job, or to keep you in the social setting. And her call to action, which I think employers can apply in the context of neurodiversity, but also in the context of general mental wellness, is create an environment where your rules, in other words, how a person can survive and thrive in the workplace, are written, as she puts it far more eloquently than I can, in the blackest of ink. And that's really what we're looking to do, is old rules, new rules.
Oh, Brett, you've gone on to mute.
Yeah, and we've got to approach it from a point of view where we consider all sides and we just do the best we can. We can't do more.
Great. Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you. And from my perspective, I mean, I have to use this opportunity to really highlight that conflict exacerbates mental illness and general illness in any workplace. We work in the area of conflict management and dispute resolution, and we believe very strongly that if you manage conflict in a more effective way, if you minimize the upheaval of dealing with disputes when they've gone, further along the conflict path, it really does benefit organizations. So please, we train conflict management and dispute resolution skills training. That's what we specialize in, and we certainly see the effect of that type of training in organizations when they undertake it. Another consideration is workplace mediators. We have had a massive increase in the requests for workplace mediators, conflict between colleagues, conflict within teams, conflict between different departments in organizations, and getting someone neutral in to assist with that conflict management, because the sooner it gets dealt with, the better the chances are that these don't escalate into grievances and they don't escalate into hearings or tribunals or any of those issues. And they certainly ensure that workplaces are more productive and happier places. So we are running a mediator training program for workplace mediation, I think next week, Friday. Please look out for that if you are a mediator and you'd like to extend your skills. And if you're from organizations, it's really useful to have internal mediators in your organization who are there to assist their colleagues. We've been running internal mediator skills programs in big organizations particularly, and that also really ensures that conflicts are dealt with in a sensitive, consensus-based manner early on in the dispute. So speak to us about setting up a panel of mediators in your organization as well. Okay, just that leaves me, now that I've done some promotion for my organization, it just does leave me to thank our guests. Thank you very much, Amandla, Angela, Brett, and Winnie. You've been absolutely amazing. It's been a very interesting conversation. We will send out all their presentations to you, or references to the tools that we spoke about during the webinar, to all the attendees. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Robin, for keeping us on the screen. And we look forward to the next conversation. Bye-bye.